Good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, February 16th, 8:33 a.m., and this is the first half of the morning for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. Today, we're returning to Act 250 and S234, an act relating to changes to Act 250. We've been taking testimony for 5-6 weeks now, accumulated some questions, have some guests in with us this morning to help us address some of the questions that have emerged. And I'd like to jump right to Ms. Collins, Maura Collins, who's come in to talk to us about provisions related to the affordability of housing and priority housing projects. Questions came up about what the language is doing here, how it links to current practice, the older language that's being struck. And so, Ms. Collins, if you could explain to us how the affordability, the priority housing project and affordability language works and why it needs revision, that would be helpful to the committee. Thanks.
Be happy to. My name is Maura Collins. I'm the director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and you are right to be confused. This is very confusing, and I think if any of us had started with a blank piece of paper, we would not have referenced so many definitions in so many convoluted ways, but I'm sure there was really good reasons every time the statute was adjusted to accommodate for new ideas. And now, what we have is that priority housing projects, in short, are valuable because they are exempted from the traditional Act 250 process. And a 2017 report estimated that the value of that exemption was roughly about $33,000 in permit fees and 6 months of development time. That said, any numbers from 2017, we should know that they're probably bigger now. But to be a PHP, a priority housing project, housing development must contain a minimum number of homes, and that adjusts by the size of the community. And it must be mixed income housing, meaning that some of the housing must be affordable and the rest can be market rate, whatever price. The struggle we have with the current definition and why there needs to be a change is that when you look at that definition of mixed income housing, for the owner occupied housing, not rentals, but for the owner occupied housing, it is setting a purchase price limit based on a number that VHFA produces. If you read, and I just looked, I didn't see my testimony up on your committee website yet, but it might be there now. There is a PDF memo from me that you'll see that lays this out. But the homeownership definition references VHFA's, and this is a quote, new construction targeted area purchase price limits. The problem we have is that since the Great Recession over a decade ago, VHFA shifted its mortgage business. And now we do not have new construction targeted area purchase price limits. So if any developer, if any municipality, if a district commission or court were to try to verify what VHFA's new construction targeted area purchase price limit was over the past decade, it would have no such number to reference. So we went and changed our line of business, frankly, not thinking that this was a language in Act 250, and we've left the state in a bit of a lurch. So, one would naturally ask, well, could we just use your purchase price limits that you have now, even if they're not new construction targeted area limits? You could, but we have a couple different purchase price limits. We have 2 different programs, and so we have different limits for the different programs. So we'd have to pick which program you'd want to point to. And to be honest, One of the programs doesn't need to have purchase price limits. We choose to impose them because we're a mission-driven lender who serves a very niche part of the market. And so we impose them on ourselves. But if the legislature doesn't point to the right number, it could have no limits at all on this. So knowing that this is a problem, we've known this for years. We have brought this to the legislature. Each time y'all pick up Act 250, we say, oh, we have an opportunity to fix the language. I've testified on this to your committee in sessions past, as well as Senate Housing Committee. Frankly, y'all have approved these kinds of changes before, but Act 250 legislation that this has been tied to has never made it over the finish line. And so this hasn't ever been fully fixed. But knowing that it's a problem, knowing that we're getting calls from communities asking about what's your new construction targeted area purchase price limit, because I can't find it on the website, we began publishing an annual chart of the maximum rent and purchase price affordability thresholds. And these are based on HUD's median incomes that they set every year. And every year we update it, and you can go and look at a chart that shows what the purchase price limits are at various income levels. So the benefits of this language change that's been proposed is, one, it untethers Act 250 from VHFA's mortgage business. Frankly, we have two programs right now. One has purchase price limits, one doesn't, but we choose to impose them anyway. If either of those programs goes away, or if we change those limits, you all have more predictability about what is affordable under Act 250 without caring about what VHFA is doing for its own business reasons. It also guarantees that there are annual updates every year. We don't change our purchase price limits every year. This would make sure that this follows the market. This chart that we produce adjusts by the number of bedrooms and ensures more accurate limits by the size of the home. Right now, I think it was the VNRB has pointed out that you could build a 1-bedroom home and it would have the same purchase price limit as a 4-bedroom home, whereas we know that the cost of construction and affordability should be very different. The chart that VHFA publishes takes regional differences into consideration and has different levels for different counties. And one of the most important pieces, affordability, based on the proposed changes that you see in the legislation, the affordability is based on income of Vermonters and not home prices. So to illustrate this, between 2016 and last year, the median home price went up 32%, whereas HUD's income limits only went up by 5%. So it's not following the market, where an overheated market would allow more homes that are less affordable to be called PHPs and get that benefit, but instead it pegs the affordability to actually what Vermonters are earning, as opposed to just what home prices are. And we know that incomes and home prices don't follow the same trajectory. And finally, it really sets these limits based on HUD income estimates and takes VHFA out of the situation largely. Right now, our purchase price limits are voted on by VHFA's Board of Commissioners, who are 9 lovely, hardworking, smart people. But that is a board of directors of one organization who is essentially setting this PHP limit, as opposed to the chart VHFA produces is based on HUD's income estimates, which stem from census data that's collected every year. So we are proposing that the reference to VHFA's new construction target area purchase price limits be stricken. That will maintain the goal of prioritizing housing that includes a meaningful amount of affordable housing. It will eliminate the reference to our program that no longer exists. It'll make sure that geographic differences are considered, and it'll protect the affordability of homes by ensuring that smaller sized homes are priced lower. They have a lower price threshold than larger homes. And we will continue to produce this chart that we've been doing and set the affordability at 120% of what's affordable to median income. I'm happy to chat now.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's a helpful explanation of where we were versus why we would move to the new, updated cross-reference to the HUD-based system. So let me pause and see if there are any committee questions. Okay. Well,
No,
thank
very
you.
helpful.
One other question that came up relating to PHPs, well, two others. One was around sort of the trends over time. The relief that you talked about from being released from Act 250, and I was actually surprised, and it was good to have data. 6 months, shaving 6 months off of project time is a significant amount, sounds like a significant amount of time to me. 33,000, I'm surprised the number is actually that small, but whatever, that's the balance, and that's kind of the incentive, one of the incentives. I know that the other thing behind all this is access to different funds, like but from a common shared value sort of perspective, is the 20% of housing that must be affordable in a PHP strike you as kind of a fair bargain? You know, I mean, we've talked in this committee and elsewhere about how do we arrive at 20? Is that number trending down? Are we asking for a smaller percentage over time? Can you talk a little bit about the history on that, on the bargain?
I can talk about my impressions. I can't talk about the history. I think Ellen was going to look into that. I don't know if, at least some testimony I watched from last week, I think she was going to try to see how that percentage has changed. I don't have that long of a history with this to know if it was a different number at another time. I will say that having 20% of the units be affordable does achieve the public policy goal of mixed income housing, which the legislature, that's what this is a definition of,
Right.
is trying to have some amount of the housing be affordable, but not have this be a program for fully subsidized government support housing where the majority of units are affordable. Those qualify, but it also includes projects that have no public subsidy. And I think that's just very important to remember through this, that there are funding priorities and incentives, and there are regulatory priorities and incentives. And when it comes to funding, when we actually give money to a developer and say, build affordable housing, oh my gosh, are there rules? Like Act 250 is nothing compared to what the hoops we make affordable housing developers jump through. Must have 25% of the units be set aside for homeless, must be in designated areas, or at least historic settlement patterns. But really, VHFA, we give so many points to being in designated areas that if you're not in a designated area, it's far less likely you'll get our money. Energy efficiency standards. It goes on and on and on of what we require when we actually give money to someone to build affordable housing. That's covered through other means. What the legislature is providing with this PHP exemption is regulatory relief, which has a value of, I don't know, in 2017, the estimate that the state came out with was 33 grand. So I think there is a question of how much do you get for 33 grand? And that 33 grand was for a whole project, not per unit. So it really comes down to, if the benefit is, I'm going to make up numbers to be clear, but if the benefit is 5 or 10 grand per unit of relief between time and permitting costs, I think the state needs to just weigh how much it can ask for that level of relief.
Okay, thank you. Senator McCormick. We can't hear you yet.
Okay, here I am. Thanks. It's always the old men who forget that they're muted. Um, you use the term, you refer to hoops that developers have to jump through. There are a lot of people, I think, who think of Act 250 as being a lot of hoops you have to jump through. I am not of that opinion. I suppose I could be persuaded otherwise, but until I'm persuaded otherwise, my view is that Act 250 provides a meaningful review that greatly benefits the people of Vermont. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the extent to which the alternative review, when a development is exempt from Act 250, how the alternative approach to environmental review, does it equal Act 250? Does it fall short? If so, how far short does it fall? Is it better? Is it more review? Could you compare the level of environmental protection?
Yeah, and I can't, because I do think it's apples and oranges. When I say that to get subsidized housing that has either VHCB money in it or VHFA loans or tax credits or the like, that is looking at housing priorities broadly and not just the environmental protections that Act 250 looks at. And so I think it's a very different set of hoops that one is jumping through. We do know, and I don't have the report in front of me to quote it, but I think it was the VNRC came out with a report that said that VHCB's housing projects and the investments that VHCB makes is one of the best examples of smart growth and doing the right thing and concentrating housing in the right places as anything. And VHCB and VHFA make sure that our funding priorities are aligned so that the housing that they create with their funding is what we are funding as well. So I am very proud of the green building and design standards that our organizations hold all projects to, as well as the site-based requirements that we have to make sure that housing is in smart growth areas. At the same time, Act 250 brings in an entirely different sets of conversations to the mix than government subsidized housing, VHCB and VHFA do. And so they are very different hoops that one is jumping through. I also think it's important to know that not all PHPs would have to go through VHCB and VHFA's processes. If there was a way a developer could afford to build a housing development that didn't require any government subsidy, then it could do that if 20% of those units were affordable under a certain threshold. And so we also can't assume that all housing that's mixed income will be the kind of government subsidized housing that I'm talking about when I say that, we make folks jump through a lot of hoops.
Sorry, Senator McCormick, do you have something more?
Yeah, just to recap, but you did say that there are certain conversations that are stimulated under Act 250 that are not stimulated.
Absolutely.
Do you consider those conversations to have any value?
Yes, I absolutely do. I believe there is value to Act 250 and the process.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I'm done, Mr. Chairman.
Senator McDonald. Anything?
Yes.
Yeah. Good morning. No, when you lean forward, that's usually the prequel to having a question. So, apparently, I misread that. Senator Westman or Senator Campion? Okay.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Ms. Collins, can you sort of just offer us a ballpark figure for percentage of priority housing projects that do come through VHFA? Do you have a sense of that? Are you half of them?
I saw, well, it's homeownership and rental housing is different. I saw a chart from the state recently around the rental housing that was deemed PHP, and all but one of the projects had gotten VHCB or VHFA money, and
Yeah.
that one that hadn't, VHFA has been in conversations, ongoing conversations with that developer. And I would not be surprised if they come in and apply for some kind of funding from us and maybe VHCB, I don't know. So, so I, based on last year's PHP designations that I saw, 100% of the rental housing was going through VHCB and VHFA's process from a chart I saw from ACCD. I don't know, to be honest, if the chart I saw, it didn't include any homeownership housing. So I don't know if that means that they were just sending me the rental chart out of FYI, or if there were no homeownership PHPs approved last year. And that would be a question that I or you can ask the state ACCD, because it, I don't know how much of that's happening. There's not a lot of affordable, subsidized homeownership housing being developed that would trigger Act 250, because the homeownership, affordable homeownership developments, largely that we know of, are very small. You know, I know that we've given homeownership tax credits to 4-unit developments, 6-unit developments, and the like. I can think of one larger development, but that started a few years ago. So maybe that's why it wasn't in the data set that I saw, because it wasn't just from last year.
Okay. And then you said one thing that's interesting, that basically your scoring system for evaluating a project, that generally it's not hard and fast, but the scoring system generally selects projects in designated areas. Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
VHFA chooses to assign weights to public policy priorities of the state. And with that, different categories can get different number of points, and the highest number of points you can get for one category is 5 points, and that's what we award to the location of the housing. And if you're in a designated downtown village center, you get 5 points. Some of the lesser designations, meaning like the neighborhood development areas or whatever, may get 4 points, but that point system has served us well in terms of directing development into those designated areas largely.
Okay. And then my last question is, if we were to let non-PHP housing projects, rental or homeowner, homeowner projects also be offered an Act 250 exemption, would we be removing one of the incentives to develop priority housing projects?
I believe so.
Yeah. And
yeah.
I don't know if you've thought of anything that might be compensatory. I mean, I think the last thing we want to do is to disincentivize projects that include mixed income or affordable housing. That would be a pretty negative unintended consequence of trying to help other projects move forward on a more timely way. And I think one of the things we're trying to sort out is, how could we achieve both, not have one come at the cost of the other? I don't know if you have any wisdom on or thoughts on that one.
I would hesitate to say there's wisdom. I have heard some discussions and folks playing around with the idea of, if ARPA funded housing in designated areas could be exempt from Act 250. But honestly, I would want to have further conversations to understand, well, when would ARPA funded housing in a designated area not be a PHP anyway? Because if it's ARPA funded housing, it probably has affordability to it. And so I guess that would maybe it's less than 20% of the project. And so maybe that would, those projects would come in, meaning a development gets 10 10% of its units are going to be affordable. And so those 10% get some ARPA funding to support that activity. And it would not qualify for a PHP because it's only 10% of the development, but it's in a designated area and it does have some affordable housing. So that would be something. But I welcome the fact that that's not a very well thought out answer, and that in conversation with others, I might realize that there were some unintended consequences of that. But that's one thing that I have heard discussed a bit in that way.
The other possibility, that since ARPA funds are intended to address COVID impacts, and we know it's lower income Vermonters who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, it does seem as though there's a genuine nexus between affordable housing being a response to the impacts of COVID, and then ARPA funding coming in to support it. So it may be that it works fine, but I think what we just want to be careful and thoughtful about is not creating a disincentive to do priority housing projects that aren't receiving, that may well not be receiving any ARPA funding.
And I just want to make sure it was clear that I was talking about ARPA funded housing projects in designated areas. I'm a huge fan of the various designation processes. I think that the initiative that it shows the municipality takes to go through a thoughtful planning process and to really look inward and to recognize that each community in Vermont is very unique. And so having different designations, I think, makes sense for the different needs of a community. But I really always like incentivizing and rewarding communities that have gone through that kind of thoughtful process in partnership with the state. There's some accountability there that I just really appreciate. And so I think that that is an important component, that the more we can do to reward housing in designated areas, the better, because it encourages more communities to go through that thoughtful process locally.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in. I just want to double check on two fronts. One, any last committee questions for Ms. Collins? All right. And Ms. Collins, I want to check with you. Do we not get into anything that you said, oh, I want to make sure I mention that while I'm in committee this morning?
No, we covered it all. And like I said, if this conversation comes up again, it gets really confusing really quickly. So I encourage you to look at the memo I provided, and that will just remind you of what I walked through, and I'd be happy to come back if there are follow-up questions.
Okay, thank you for that. So it's on our website and will get distributed to everyone in the community, the committee as well. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you again, and thanks for coming in. With that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Rose, who has been on the screen at various times and seems not to be here at the moment. So I'm not sure if he has an unstable connection. I've seen him come and go 3 times. All right. Well, so while Mr. Rose recovers his connection, let's move on to hear from Thomas Weiss. Mr. Weiss, good morning. You've written to the committee. Your documents have been distributed, and we have like to set aside approximately 20 minutes to focus on the areas of interest or concern to you in 234, and thank you for letting me know that you've been following our committee conversations remotely, so you're up to speed on what's under discussion. So good morning, and thanks for coming back. Good to see, well, can't see you, but good to see you this year.
Oh, good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning on this bill. I am Thomas Weiss. I'm a civil engineer with experience in permitting of projects and in performing environmental reviews in hydrology and flood studies, evaluation and design of sewer systems, and I'm also certified as a Class 1 designer under the wastewater and potable water supply system rules. My interest is to preserve and expand the ability of individuals to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect them and their surroundings. Act 250 is the only permitting process that I have seen or worked with that allows meaningful participation by individuals. So retaining jurisdiction is important to me. And these comments point out troubling aspects of the bill and provide suggestions for amending them. And I don't know whether you want to do questions section by section or at the end. It's your choice, Mr. Chair.
I'll watch and let's do questions as they come up.
Okay. My first point is, please do not weaken Act 250 through the guise of temporary provisions with sunsets. My experience is that sunsets too often become permanent, and also the provisions proposed to expedite permitting weaken Act 250, and eliminating Act 250 will not expedite projects, and I'll get into that later. And next major section, please reject the governor's proposal to have district commissions abdicate their supervisory authority over the Act 250 criteria. I am referring to the notwithstanding language that would allow Act 250 permits to be issued without the district commissions knowing what is in the permits and without knowing whether the other permits comply with the Act 250 criteria. And I referred to it as the governor's proposal because it was supported by Natural Resources Board, Agency of Natural Resources, and Agency of Transportation at an earlier hearing of yours. And please do retain Act 250's independent review of whether a proposed project satisfies the Act 250 criteria. This is often referred to as supervisory authority. The administration's proposal to allow Act 250 permits to be issued before all other permits is part of a long-running attempt of the administration to require district commissions to accept A&R permits uncritically. The governor's proposal is another way to accomplish the same end. Previous attempts were more blunt by explicitly trying to make permits non-rebuttable. This proposal accomplishes the same goal, non-rebuttability of permits for projects without hearings. Then, the next step likely will be to try to make permits non-rebuttable at projects with hearings too. And Ellen Tchaikovsky stated the situation regarding the governor's proposal well last Friday, the 11th. Governor's proposal represents a significant policy shift, and my apologies to Ms. Tchaikovsky because I used a different word in my written testimony, misquoting her in my written document. It should be that she said it represents a significant policy shift. She also mentioned there is case law that establishes the overarching scope of Act 250 called supervisory authority. District commissions cannot do the holistic review they are required to do if the other permits are not yet issued and the commissions cannot review them. Act 250 is significantly different from the Public Utilities Commission process because the PUC lacks the supervisory authority that district commissions have over environmental issues, and the district commissions no longer will have the authority to rebut permits when the permits do not satisfy the Act 250 criteria. District commissions, as you know, now may decline to rely on other permits that do not satisfy the Act 250 criteria. In addition, there is no mechanism for the Natural Resources Board to ensure that all permits have been issued. That would likely be left to compliance investigations and enforcement actions. The NRB lacks resources now for adequate enforcement, and the governor's proposal will exacerbate that lack of resources. Minor permits generally have no parties to advocate for compliance with the Act 250 permit. Only if there is a pre-hearing or hearing can those with a particularized interest obtain party status, and minor permits do not have hearings. which means that there's nobody to monitor what's going on and make sure that the permit's being complied with in the minor permits. And the governor's proposal does not shorten the permitting process. The NRB chair did not know the effect of the proposal on the timeline. She suggested getting other testimony. And here is that other testimony. And the answer is the proposal does not shorten the timeline at all. The NRB provided you a list of housing projects that had Act 250 permits. And I looked at minor projects because that is what the governor's proposal focuses on. That list contained 48 minor projects. As I researched the time between the receipt of the last permit or document and the issuing of the decision for all projects where that time was longer than the median. Projects where the decision is issued in less than the median time are unlikely to delay a project. So accepting the governor's proposal does not expedite permits because processing of Act 250 permits runs in parallel with processing of other permits. And I found that not just in this analysis, but also in an analysis of the wastewater and potable water supply permits that I sent to you a few weeks ago. Anyway, there are 20 minor projects with whose time between the receipt of the last document and decision was greater than the median. Of those projects, the minimum time given was the same day, meaning that the projects were issued, the Act 250 permits were issued the same day the other permits came in. The median number of days was 6. The maximum number of days was 34, yes, a bit long. Only 5 of the projects had a period between the last permit coming in and the Act 250 permit being issued of more than 10 days. And the majority of the last documents received in the cases studied were A&R documents or permits. So allowing Act 250 to issue permits on receiving other permits doesn't save time in general. The median between the last contingent permit and decision of 6 days is too short to be considered a delay. And projects have a schedule that is controlled by the permitting process in its entirety. Removing one permit, such as Act 250, from the process does not expedite a project because of the interactions of the timings of all the other projects. That concludes my testimony on that issue. So please do not accept that notwithstanding action language. Moving on to the sections in the bill itself.
Mr. Weiss,
Section 1.
Mr. Weiss, can I ask you to respond to something that we just heard from Ms. Collins, and that was that in her characterization, so thanks for that data analysis. It does seem quite different than Ms. Collins's remark that she thought that priority housing projects saved approximately 6 months on development time and roughly $33,000 in fees. I'm trying to compare, juxtapose those two sets of information, and they don't seem to align. So I'm not questioning either party's data. I'm just trying to make sense of it. Do you have any thoughts on that? And I know that you just heard those numbers for the first time, just as we did. Maybe that's something we could come back to if there's nothing obvious to you about how the characterizations would be so different.
You asked a two-part question. I'll get to the $33,000 first. That's $33,000 over the whole project. And I would think a more relevant number to evaluate in terms of affordability would be take that number and basically divide it by the number of housing units and the number of months in the 15-year period that affordability is guaranteed for a rental unit to come up with a monthly price per unit.
Right.
I did a previous analysis on that, and those take that back. I did the analysis on a different permit. So I don't know how that comes out, but I would think that would be a
Right.
relevant factor in determining the effect of the Act 250 fees on a given project.
Yep.
The other part of the question is differences in shortening the project time. I have been looking at, in this and some other analyses, the interaction of permits. And when I take Act 250, or in the case of the wastewater, potable water supply permits, out of the mix, it doesn't shorten the time of the project appreciably. So I would want to look into how ACCD came up with that 6-month figure in its report. And while Ms. Collins was talking, I tried quickly to find out how that happened. I looked up the report, but I would have to analyze it and see what they actually did and how they actually came up with that number.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, I wasn't trying to sort of pop a surprise question on you, but since you have done a lot of analysis, I wanted to share that. So if you could look into that further, that would be helpful. Let's go back to your plan testimony. Thanks.
Or maybe you could ask ACCD to figure out how they came up with it.
Right.
Since I'm not sure the numbers I would need are in that report.
Okay, we'll follow up with ACCD. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. So moving on to my section 1, it's about flood hazards. It is neighborhood development areas, and there are 2 parts of that I would like to comment on: flood hazards and the neighborhood allowing on-site sewage treatment in neighborhood development areas. Regarding flood hazards, I believe the section adds unnecessary complexity in its proposals for management of flood hazard areas. It also penalizes those municipalities that already regulate flood hazard areas by apparently causing them to scrap their existing flood hazard bylaws and start over. Removing the provisions allowing infill development. I worked at a company and helped create flood insurance studies and mapping in Vermont at the start of the National Flood Insurance Program. So I've got a feel for how rivers flow, and a lot of my college and graduate school work was also on hydrology and hydraulics. And my focus in that job was on developing the flood frequency curves from the stream gauge records and the computer modeling that determined the flood boundaries and floodways. Putting a building in a flood hazard area always increases the elevation of the flood, and increases the risk to others. The magnitude of the increase in elevation might be negligible or might not be negligible, and only detailed modeling will tell, and there are always larger floods than what we designed for. If you choose to put more people in harm's way by allowing infill development in flood hazard areas, then please keep it simple. Require that municipalities work within what they already know, their Chapter 117, instead of an unfamiliar chapter in a different title. Our goal should be moving out of flood hazard areas, not putting more into them. Neighborhood development areas and the flood hazard rules, no, they don't even use the same definition of what infill is. The flood hazard rules are designed to allow the state to regulate development that municipalities are prohibited from regulating. I don't see how municipal bylaws can be consistent with rules that cover activities that municipalities are not allowed to regulate. I don't know if this is Mr. Rose's area of expertise, but you might put this to him if it is. The other point in Section 1 regarding on-site sewage treatment in neighborhood development areas. Septic systems have isolation zones around them. These zones have restrictions on what can be done inside them. They have to be a certain distance from certain features. Statute allows those isolation zones to extend onto a neighbor's property, and there's little that the neighbor can do about it. Infill development likely will be on smaller lots with a higher chance of encroaching on a neighbor's property. Thus, I recommend that isolation zones be contained on the infill parcel. And I'm not talking about changing the whole program to prevent isolation zones from extending over, but specifically for the infill development that's being contemplated in this bill. On Section 5, amending the criterion on flooding, it's long overdue by decades. Go ahead. Section 7 through 9 in forest blocks, it lumps together the criteria of forest blocks and connecting habitat, and they have separate functions and needs and should not be lumped together. And I have additional comments on that I sent to you in a previous letter back in January. Have the definitions of connecting habitat, forest block, and if you keep it, fragmentation, so that all new incursions are covered by Act 250. Replace the requirements for connecting habitat and fragmentation into the criteria. This would expedite, word that you've heard often in your committee, the protection of forest blocks and connecting habitat by avoiding the rulemaking. Section 10 on resource mapping. Please do not start placing specific layers into the resource mapping statute. Please use session law to establish specific layers if you must have them. I've found that the layers that are in the ANR Resource Atlas and the ACCD Planning Atlas are actually quite useful, quite adequate, and they weren't told in statute to put them in. So I think if you just leave that alone, it'll be fine. Let them know that you'd like that. I think it's forest blocks that you wanted put in. Section 11, roads and driveways. You've been wrestling with the road rule over multiple hearings. Why not explore alternatives to using the proxy of roads and driveways to eliminate adverse effects on forests? Instead, you might consider a simple, if clearing or disturbance goes more than 100 feet or 200 feet or 300 feet or whatever, then it's development and under the jurisdiction of Act 250. This next comment is actually not in my written testimony, but it has to do with Section 14, which is reversing a just reversed Supreme Court decision. I suggest that you consider leaving well enough alone, take out Section 14 from the bill, and rely on the revised Supreme Court decision. If you put it into the bill, then people can start tinkering with it and with unexpected results. Section 15 requests that there be no agricultural mitigation at airports. I suggest you remove that section from the bill. Mitigation procedures need to be retained. And the definition of primary agricultural soil, I don't think it has been raised in your committee. It has an exception built into it. If the district commission finds that the soils have lost their agricultural potential, they don't meet that definition, and therefore they're not part of Criterion 9B. Land in the airport likely can show this and not even be required to be, they're not primary agricultural soils, so there's no need to mitigate. Lands outside the airport do need to be evaluated under Criterion 9B and mitigated under Section 6093. As you are aware, converted farmland is lost forever. We need to conserve farmland for food production. We cannot afford to decrease our existing primary agricultural soils without conserving other sites and compensation. Section 19 calls for a study of the Natural Resources Board structure. I ask that you remove the study and actually get behind H492, structure of the Natural Resources Board, and support that bill's proposal for an environmental review board. We don't need another study committee. This has been studied over and over and over and over again. The Commission on the Future of Act 250 recommended that the Natural Resources Board hear appeals of decisions of the district commissions. the House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee is proposing a board structure, is working on a bill that will propose a board structure that will hear appeals. It would define the membership of the board and the appointment process, and it would leave the responsibilities and authorities of the district commissions alone. My last comment has to do with exempting transportation projects from Act 250. I don't think that has come up as a proposal specifically in your committee. I include it here because exempting transportation from Act 250 is on the governor's priority list according to the NRB chair's testimony last Friday. So if it does come into consideration, please read my explanation of this position in the enclosure. The enclosure meaning the enclosure to this document that I have. Conclusion, I hope that you find these recommendations worthwhile and that you will amend S234 to implement them. Thank you for taking the time to hear this presentation. And if you have any questions, and I still have time left and the chair agrees, I'm willing.
Okay, let me see, Senator McDonald.
I just want to comment that Mr. Weiss, in doing his homework, looks at all the different proposals and then connects them to each other. And I find that when we look at a particular suggestion, we tend to look at it in a much more narrow view and don't see it as interfering with, overriding something, undermining something. And Mr. Weiss has helped to see the fabric of how that system works. And I have one specific question. When we're dealing with the subsidies, Mr. Weiss suggested that if we're trying to figure out the economic benefit, we take the 15 years by the amount of money we're saving and divide it by all the separate units and find out, what we're really providing for in dollar-wise per unit. And I asked my colleagues on the committee once again, why are we obliged to grant a mere 15 years of affordability in exchange for the subsidies and rule changes that we grant to these projects? Why we are selling or allowing tenants to be, get 15 years and be evicted. I mean, you can't even have a kid and have them get through high school and you've lost your affordable apartment because the landlord no longer has to rent to you and can, evict you and charge market rates. So that would be my question.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we have anyone in the room who can probably answer that question. But yeah, we've talked about the longevity of the affordability covenant. And I don't think we have a clear answer as to how we got to 15 years.
Mr. Bray?
Yes, Mr. Weiss.
I'd like to make two comments. First of all, regarding tying things together, that's what Act 250 does. All of the other permits are those individual things that don't look at each other and look at the interactions. So to me, that is a major benefit of Act 250 in tying everything together. And on the duration of affordability, it originally was 30 years. It got reduced to 20 years, and it was then reduced to 15 years. It was set at 30 years back in 2008 and has been reduced to 20 in 2014 and then to 15 in 2017. So you've talked about how it had changed, but this didn't actually come into the Act 250 statute until 2008.
Okay,
just a little bit of historical information.
thank you. I remember one of the changes, the 20 to 15, I think, one. I didn't realize how it's actually a relatively brief period of time, 14 years. It's been, well, less than 14 years, it was halved. All right, and I don't know what kind of market conditions are, might have influenced that decision. All right, so thank you again. Any other committee comments or questions for Mr. Weiss, or comments in response to his testimony, or requests to hear from anyone based on what he has brought up? Senator McCormick?
I just want to thank Mr. Weiss for his testimony. I think it was well put.
Okay. All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. We are going to move on to
You're very welcome.
Our pleasure. Mr. Rose, good morning. We are taking testimony from I think it was Mr. Evans at A&R, and some questions came up around the floodplains or the definitions related to flood hazards and how they might influence eligibility for FEMA supports for recovery. So we just wanted to check in with you, and I think my most general question would be: have you looked at the provisions related to flooding in this bill, and are they something you support or something you have concerns about? Could you give us a read on the issue of flooding, and then how those definitions might then have consequences in your world, helping people respond to those events?
Yes, I can try. Good morning, Mr. Chairman Bray, Vice Chair Westman, Senators McCormick, Campion, McDonald. Nice to be here with all of you. For the record, Ben Rose, Recovery and Mitigation Section Chief at Vermont Emergency Management. Sue Minter asked me to join the Irene Recovery Office just about 10 years ago this month, and I got dropped into FEMA world, and the final third of my career has been as Vermont's FEMA whisperer. So, going on $500 million of FEMA disaster recovery grants. And the disasters keep coming. I stumbled into a growth industry. So I'm here to talk to you about FEMA implications. And bottom line up front, I don't think that anything in this bill creates major problems from a FEMA standpoint. But I did go back and listen to the testimony where Rob Evans suggested that you ask me, and I think it was based on Senator McDonald's questions about housing units which are served not by municipal wastewater systems or by a community or alternate wastewater system approved by A&R, but instead by something private. And the question is, what happens when there's a big flood and FEMA comes to town with 75% federal share disaster recovery money to those folks? It's a good question. And I don't know the solution, but the answer is that FEMA public assistance is only available for public infrastructure. And so a wastewater pipeline that gets damaged is routinely covered with 75% federal share, plus a percentage through our emergency relief and assistance program, which is the state match that we provide that Rob talked about, which is a different rate for different municipalities depending on how much they've done. But the upshot is that if the municipal system breaks in a flood, there's lots of money there to help fix it. When a private mound system gets wiped out or something, people are on their own, and they best hope they have flood insurance which covers it. And most Vermonters don't have flood insurance. It's the same problem with private roads and driveways, by the way. A lot of the damage in our last storm, July 29th, in the southern two counties was to private roads and driveways. And there's no safety net for that. And, part of mitigation is if you're in a hole, stop digging. So one of the things we can do to stop digging our flood vulnerability hole deeper is to stop building homes with steep roads and driveways because there is no help for that. But anyway, I digress. The upshot is that I went back and looked at the record of the 10 floods since Irene, and I did recall one project, and it actually was from the July 2017 storm. And we had a public assistance applicant, which was the Union Water Company of North Thetford. It serves 23 homes. It's set up as a private nonprofit. It was eligible. FEMA did come through with $15,000 federal share to help with repairs. So if a water supply or wastewater system is properly structured as a private nonprofit, it can be eligible for FEMA public assistance. But that's not a given unless you require it.
Right. Okay. And in the case of individual homes, individual mound systems or septic systems, then that's entirely a private insurance matter.
Right. Now, I will say this, that a mound system is not the infrastructure we worry about most in floods, especially if we're not building the homes in the flood hazard area.
Right. Okay. The other point that I think came up, actually, Mr. Weiss just mentioned it, and Senator McDonald, I think, may have raised this question also, was even sort of thoughtfully placed infill development in a flood zone will have some impact on water height. I think Mr. Evans was saying that they do a lot of modeling to ensure that the allowed development doesn't have an impact on velocity, but you might end up with height impacts. Do you have anything you can share on that side of the story?
Well, I mean, let me first of all say that I'm not an engineer, and I defer to A&R on flood modeling and flood forecasting and hydraulic flows and base flood elevations and all of that technical stuff. However, I do have the FEMA hazard mitigation program, and that has a lot of rules about what's eligible based on whether or not it really mitigates flood risk. And so when we do a buyout of a flood vulnerable structure and remove that structure, and the municipality ends up owning that lot as open space, think of Water Street in Northfield, which is now a soccer field and a community garden instead of a bunch of homes that get repetitively flooded. It's a success story. A buyout is definitely giving room back to the river and mitigating the downstream flood risk. When somebody applies to do an elevation of an existing structure, what they're basically doing is hardening a structure, which is forcing the water to go somewhere else. And so sometimes an elevation project is in fact exacerbating the downstream flood vulnerability. Elevations are tough. They're a Band-Aid. On the other hand, we have whole downtown villages, historic villages, that are built below base flood elevation. And so we're never going to mitigate our way out of being flood vulnerable. And there are places where it's appropriate to harden against the next flood.
Okay. And if the bill were to proceed in its current form, do you see any, do you have any concerns about unforeseen consequences, and then the eligibility of FEMA funding available, I guess, a sort of a non-scientific lay way of saying this might be, if you've built in a place that's a hazard, you've done so at your own risk, therefore you're not eligible for FEMA support. I don't know if there is that kind of a way of analyzing the situation. Just want to make sure.
So in broad strokes, I don't think there's any massive unintended consequence with respect to FEMA eligibility here. I want to reiterate that mostly when FEMA comes to town, it's for public assistance to public infrastructure. And we haven't had a flood that rose to the magnitude of triggering federal individual assistance since 2011 with Irene and the spring flooding then. Mostly homeowners are on their own with flood damage. There is one thing I wanted to call to your attention though while I'm here in section 11, which might be an unintended consequence you can easily address. Section 11 is the definitions, and there's well, let's see, I have it on my screen. In the definitions on page 16 of the version I'm looking at, sorry, which is talking about the road rule piece. And I need to say for the record, I'm here, the Department of Public Safety is neutral on this bill. You know, I'm not talking to the whole scope of the bill here, but there is a definition of road, which includes any new road or upgrade of a class 4 highway, blah, 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 blah. Routine maintenance is excluded, and it shall include replacement of a culvert or ditch, applying new stone grading or making repairs after adverse weather. And I would recommend adding a few words to that to clarify that upsizing or upgrading an existing structure is included within the definition of routine maintenance. Because in general, our state general stream alteration permit is requiring municipalities and private developers to improve drainage structures to mitigate future flood risk. And that's working very well. And when FEMA comes to town, we get them to pay for upsizing the structures. It's better for the fish, it's better for debris passage, and it withstands the next flood much better. What we don't want is for FEMA to be looking for an Act 250 permit every time somebody upsizes a culvert on an existing road.
Okay. Can I ask you the favor of sending the recommended language so we know how you would phrase it and precisely where you might suggest we insert it?
I will be happy to do that. I was expecting that, and I can send it by email to Jude. Is that okay?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure.
And Jude, when that comes in, if you can forward it to the committee and Ms. Chakowski, thank you.
One last comment I'd like to offer while I'm here, if you'll indulge me, is that I also appreciated Mr. Weiss's testimony in terms of trying to connect all these different dots. It's extremely complicated, and I don't envy you trying to untangle this knot. But everything is connected, and there are initiatives underway through the work on the climate action plan and in the governor's ARPA recommendations that really help us with mitigating flood risk. And the $10 million line item, for example, for non-federal match for hazard mitigation grants is a game changer for our ability to do mitigation projects. And I could go on for hours about the problems and challenges with FEMA's hazard mitigation program. And the fact that we now have the Flood Resilient Community Fund to do hazard mitigation projects that FEMA can't or won't do because of their arbitrary definitions. And, you know, Rob Evans is absolutely right that we need to be looking at the meander belts and not the FEMA drawn special flood hazard areas, which in some cases were drawn with a crayon decades ago. So our river engineers are smarter than FEMA.
Okay.
But that non-FEMA match is also, from an equity standpoint, the most rural towns with the least resources and the most vulnerable homeowners just do not have the time, energy, patience, or capital to go through the complexity of the FEMA hazard mitigation buyout project, and doing it with our state flood resilient community fund at 100% share, and or being able to provide the 25% non-FEMA match to do those buyouts makes it a much more equitable program. And we're working hard to connect the dots with the housing advocates and so forth, so that we can actually do user-friendly buyouts, for example, in mobile home parks.
Right. Well, great. I know that it seemed as though, despite Herculean efforts, there were people that many years after Irene were still trying to sort out their claims.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Senator McDonald.
Both the last two witnesses have both talked about building in flood hazard areas, and the math is pretty simple. If you've got a 1,000-foot flood plain and you build a building that is 100 feet wide, or elevate that building, you have cut the capacity of the floodplain to hold water by about 1/10. And when you do that, you've increased the width of the floodplain, and the level that other dwellings would be flooded by. If it was a 10-foot flood, it's now an 11-foot flood. To what extent, when you build on floodplains and create and increase the hazard elsewhere on the floodplain, when does the insurance companies come in and say, well, your floodplain has been increased by 10%, we're going to raise your floodplain insurance by an amount to cover the additional hazard that has been created 100 feet to your left? When does that happen?
So that is a huge can of worms. It's a very profound question, and I'll try to answer it as succinctly as I can. The rules are that if you are buying a house, or building a house for that matter, hopefully no one's building a house in a special flood hazard area at this point. But if you're buying a house that's in an existing map special flood hazard area, you're required to get National Flood Insurance Program and FIP flood insurance. Okay, you can't get a mortgage without having flood insurance. And the problem in Irene is that all the federal rules are geared to inundation flooding, and we don't have inundation flooding. We have fluvial
Scouring.
Yeah, we have mountain streams that jump their banks, and people lost their homes in Irene who said, I didn't even know I lived near a river. And then it jumped its banks and it wiped out their backyard. So, and then FEMA came and said, oh, we're not going to allow you to use hazard mitigation funding to do these 4 buyouts in Jamaica because they weren't in the special flood hazard area. And we said, the houses are gone down the stream. How can you say they weren't? Your map was wrong, not the river, But anyway, I digress. The point is that the special flood hazard area requires you to buy flood insurance. And the problem is that the National Flood Insurance Program is this weird hybrid of insurance and a government subsidy program. I mean, the whole principle of insurance is that you calculate the actuarial risk and then somebody buys it. And when the government says, okay, we will, if no one else will sell you insurance, we will, that's the government cross-subsidizing an underestimation of the flood risk in that place. And that's great if you are trying to help people who live in flood vulnerable places, but it creates a perverse incentive in the marketplace for people to continue building and living in flood vulnerable places. And every time the federal government has tried to reduce the amount of cross subsidy in the National Flood Insurance Program, people in places like Chelsea, Vermont, see their flood insurance rates about to get jacked up, and they go nuts. So it's really a difficult problem for the federal government to bring the flood insurance system back into relationship to actual risk. And again, I say, all you can really do if you're in a hole is stop digging. And
I thank the witness for building on that, because we were talking earlier about homeowners that have driveways that wash out and are not eligible for FEMA. And when we deregulate and say, hey, go ahead and build a driveway and we're not going to mess with you in the name of affordability, to make it cheaper for you to build, and your driveway gets wiped out, it turns out that what we have done is we've made it unaffordable for those very same people in the name of affordability.
yeah,
That we literally said, go ahead and save yourself a couple bucks, and then when the flood happens, they're SOL. And they turn to us and say, well, what can you do? And we say, sorry, you weren't in a flood area, and
yeah.
it's you're the one that has to write the check. And we did it in the name of saving money by deregulating and affordability thinking.
Yeah, I will comment that again, that's true, but there are also people who live in homes that they didn't build there, but they live there, and it's where they can afford to live. And over the course of those 10 floods, I've had to have some really hard conversations with private homeowners to say, there's no safety net for you. You don't have flood insurance. There's no federal program that you qualify for. There's no state program. Thank goodness we have the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund, which, if you recall, was set up with starting with $1 million seed philanthropic gift from Tony Pomerleau after Irene, and it's still going. It's got about $2 million. I'm one of the ex officio state people on the board. It has made awards to some real hard luck cases. When someone lives up a hollow with a steep driveway, and then the private bridge going up to their house gets wiped out in August, how does the fuel delivery truck get there before winter? Those are some really dire situations, and we have that private philanthropic fund as our last backstop for some of those cases.
Yeah, underpriced flood insurance seems to like an attractive nuisance. I mean, it encourages, you could, I don't know if I want to call it, I'll just say reckless behavior in a way. All right. So, well, this has been very helpful. Any more committee discussion on this point, or questions or comments for Mr. Rose? Or Mr. Rose, anything that you wanted to make sure you shared with us that you didn't get to yet because we keep asking you questions?
No, you've been generous with your time, and let me know if you have other questions. And good luck with this project. And I will send an email to Jude with a few words to add to section 11 in the definitions.
Right. Okay, great. And just to make sure I understood, so we wanted to avoid people basically building bigger roads, but you're saying that sort of you want to be able to allow for upgrades of culverts that are repeatedly washing out, et cetera, without triggering that as a sort of a road building event. It's actually just maintaining properly the road you have.
If a road is already there, we would like it to stay there without extreme repetitive cost.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I saw a neighbor lose 100 feet of driveway, about 6 feet of fill times 100 feet. So it's a very
Mr. Chairman.
expensive repair. Senator McCormick.
Yeah, it was shortly after Irene that I got an education in the benefits of larger culverts, and that we were just looking at just the wreckage all about us. My wife and I went for a walk at Texas Falls, which is federal land, and their standards are much higher in terms of culverts. They just use larger culverts, and it almost looked like nothing happened. It was just the water went through those big culverts and maybe washed a little bit out on either side of it, but it was not the total devastation you saw every place else.
Thank you. If you'll give me one more minute on that, I will just say that at the time immediately following Irene, we had a very adversarial relationship with FEMA, and my hair was on fire for a year and a half. We filed over 30 appeals with FEMA. We won more than half of them, which is unusual. And the upshot was that on second appeal, FEMA headquarters remanded to FEMA Region 1 a decision which denied a larger culvert in Townsend, Vermont. And they said this does not meet the definition of being codes and standards. It's not something that FEMA must pay for, but Region 1 can pay for it as hazard mitigation on that project. And then we handed a list of 36 other culverts to Region 1 and said, okay, this is the same fact pattern. Are you going to allow us hazard mitigation on these as well? And FEMA came up with over $1 million more to cover those culverts instead of leaving a big cost delta for the communities to comply with the state general stream alteration permit. We then made administrative technical adjustments to the state general stream alteration permit through Rod Evans' shop, and got FEMA a few years later to grudgingly acknowledge our general stream alteration permit as eligible codes and standards. And that is we basically fought a ground game with FEMA for many smaller disasters and got them to upsize culverts. The culverts that we rebuilt after Irene have already withstood multiple significant storms since then, and they're doing really well. I mean, more than 2/3 of the infrastructure we rebuilt after Irene has already survived something pretty significant. And we've seen some storms that were actually hydrologically bigger than Irene in certain watersheds since Irene, which did not do nearly as much damage. So we are making progress, largely through better culverts.
Senator Westman?
I just have to say that it is a pet peeve of mine that we're now, for the cleanup of the lake, for the cleanup of our waterways, changing the direction of culverts and ditching in town roads and forcing our small towns to do all sorts of things to stop runoff, to clean up the lake and to clean up our waterways. And we're ignoring all the private driveways and roads that are out there that create runoff also. And so anything we can do to encourage people that already have driveways and roads, and in a lot of small towns, when you do put in something new and you permit, the only thing they do is they go to the end of the driveway, they look to see if there's visual sight, and then they do nothing to talk about what the driveway should look like. So
Yep.
it's just my comment. So
Senator Campion?
Thank you, Senator Bright. A couple things. First, I really appreciate Mr. Rose's testimony. I think he also makes a compelling case for why the road rule itself that we've been talking about is so important. Secondly, I would say that the piece about the federal culverts is really intriguing because, I'm thinking of my district as well. I'm not sure why our state size doesn't match the federal size. I mean, if the federal culverts are so terrific and they're making things, oh, you're saying they're not?
Oh, there are no federal culverts. I mean,
I thought you said, oh, I see. So because when Senator McCormick, I misunderstood, it was on federal land, the culvert just happened to be larger, but there was no regulation around the size of the culvert.
right. I think it's on the Green Mountain National Forest, so the federal government is the landowner.
But it's
Right.
their
So there's no federal requirement in terms of culvert size, anything like that.
No,
It just
when FEMA
happens
comes
to be,
town,
it just
they-
happens to be working on Texas Falls.
Right. I mean, when
Got it.
FEMA comes to town, I mean, some small towns don't understand this initially, that it's a reimbursement program. I mean, FEMA expects to come to town and pay for whatever the locals have done to put their infrastructure back. And it's very refreshing when FEMA comes to Vermont and they come and the town says, we've done it, here's the bill. That's how it's supposed to work. And when towns get into trouble is they say, well, I'm going to wait and see what FEMA will pay for before I decide what to build. That's a really good way to get federal funding denied, because the feds hate it when people are waiting to see whether the federal checkbook will pay for something before they decide that it's necessary. And the strength of our general stream alteration permit is whether FEMA is in town or not. When it's time to replace a culvert, a municipality is bound to do what the river engineer says is needed. For that culvert.
Got it. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you again, Mr. Rose. Good to see you, and thanks for the information, and we'll watch for an email. That brings us right up to 10 o'clock on the dot. I think we actually have a lot more material to get through this morning, so rather than a full half-hour break for health and sanity, let's reduce that